Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Saoirse Healey. Tonight I am joined in the studio by Richard Thomson, the MP for Gordon. Richard, how are you this evening?
Very well, thanks. How are you doing?
Good, I'm very good, thank you. So we will start as always with our Ukraine update. It is day 617 of the war. Ukraine's commander-in-chief said the war with Russia was moving to a new stage of positional warfare involving static and attritional fighting, a phase he warned could benefit Moscow. Ukraine has reported that Russia has shelled more than 100 settlements within the last 24 hours, more than in any single day so far this year. The Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni told a prank caller posing as an African leader that there was a lot of tiredness over the war in Ukraine and that she had some ideas up her sleeves to find a way out. Ukraine's military says that more than 260 civilians have been killed in Ukraine after stepping on mines or other explosives during the 20-month war in Russia. South Korea's National Intelligence Service, the NIS, was quoted as saying that North Korea has also sent more than 10 shipments of munitions to Russia for use in the war against Ukraine, including more than 1 million artillery rounds. They also stated that North Korea is in the final stages of preparations for the launch of a spy satellite, and the chances of its third attempt succeeding are high. Kherson's governor has said that a Russian attack on the region in eastern Ukraine killed one person and injured two others, with a Russian drone strike reportedly killing another civilian in Nikopol. These claims have not yet been independently verified. Ukraine's Air Force has reported that Russia launched a number of drones and a missile in an attack that targeted military and critical infrastructure. Regional officials in the Kremenkuk oil refinery was hit. On the Telegram messaging app, the Air Force said 18 out of the 20 Russian-launched Shahed drones were destroyed before reaching their targets, as was the missile. However, according to Philip Pronin, the head of the region's military administration, a repeated target of earlier Russian attacks, the Kremenkuk oil refinery in the central region of Poltava was struck, setting it ablaze. US senators from both parties indicated support for funding for Ukraine, voicing doubts yesterday about a House Republican plan to split Joe Biden's request for $160 billion, which is £87 billion aid package. The package combines funding for Israel and Ukraine, but also includes money to boost competition with China in the Indo-Pacific, as well as security along the US border with Mexico. On Monday, the first major legislative action under the new House Speaker Mike Johnson, a standalone supplemental spending bill was unveiled for Israel only. That bill seeks to provide $14.3 billion in aid to Israel by cutting Internal Revenue Service funding and does not provide aid for Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his nightly video address yesterday that the modern world is set up in such a way that it becomes accustomed to success too quickly. When the full-scale aggression began, many in the world did not think Ukraine would endure. Zelensky has previously rejected criticism, mainly from Western sources, that the counter-offensive against Russia was proceeding too slowly, saying that the war was not akin to a Hollywood movie set. Ukraine's military said Russian forces were gearing up for fresh attacks in different sections of the front, but there has been little movement along the approximately 1,000-kilometer front line in recent months. The Swiss government has decided to lift its protection status has decided not to lift its protection status for Ukrainians fleeing the war before the 4th of March 2025. The Swiss government also set a target for labour market integration, aiming to get 40% of people with protection status S capable of work into employment by the end of next year, Reuters has reported. Opera singers in the northeastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv hope to return to the stage more than 20 months into Russia's war by performing in the basement of their theatre to be safe from the threat of Russian airstrikes. Ukraine's second largest city, which banned mass public events when Russia invaded in February 2022, is regularly targeted by missiles that can hit as little as 45 seconds after they are fired from across the Russian border 30 kilometers away. A senior UN official said Russian strikes were inflicting unimaginable suffering on the people of Ukraine and that more than 18 million Ukrainians, 40% of the population, needed humanitarian assistance. Ramesh Rajasingham, the director of coordination in the UN Humanitarian Office, told the UN Security Council yesterday that thousands of civilians had been killed in strikes on homes, schools, fields and markets since Russia's invasion in February 2022. The UN Human Rights Office has formally verified 9,900 civilians killed, but the actual number is certainly higher, he said. So, Richard, first question to you is, would you say that this is a worrying new development in the conflict regarding the increased military action and the offences? You know, is there cause for concerns about the new fronts of the war?
Sorry, I hope that's a bit better. No, the concern for me isn't so much that there's an increase in the fronts, because, as we know, the Ukrainians have been involved in shaping, as it's known, and in probing various fronts. I think what there is a danger of is both sides fighting to a stalemate, that the Ukrainians, for all their technical and military superiority, simply aren't able to overcome the sheer weight of numbers, and that the front lines end up stuck doggedly where they are. So I think that if it's going to move on, it's going to need an advance in the weaponry now. It won't be too long before the F-16s that have been pledged are able to come into effect in some force, and we'll see what impact they can have. But I think that what's really pegged the Russians back has been the allocation to the Ukrainian military of longer and longer ranged ordnance. That's forced them to put their logistics hubs further behind the front line, and that's meant that they have been less able to they've been able to dig in where they are, but it becomes harder and harder to defend what they have, and virtually impossible for them to advance in any great numbers. So for all that the Russians have been pretty dumb in much of the military tactics they've used so far, it doesn't mean they haven't learnt. But I think that Ukraine really does need that technological advantage, and an advantage in terms of the ordnance that the Western powers and its allies are able to provide it. And really, that's the only thing that's going to shift the dial in this conflict now and for so long as it lasts.
And how important do you think the potential for an American aid package is? Do you think it's going to go through, or do you think that Congress is too divided for it to pass? Or so do you think it will pass, and how important do you think it will be should it?
Well, it'll need to pass. It'll be very important for it to pass, and nobody will be happier than Vladimir Putin if it doesn't. I'm not really up to speed in the political developments in the Congress, and of course, there's always the possibility that certain members of Congress are talking with forked tongues that they play to the domestic gallery, and what they're actually looking for is something for their own side before they allow this to go through, adding the tickets to the bill, playing the politics of the pork barrel, as it's known there. So, as I say, I'm not really across the politics of it, but really I think the thing that all elected representatives in the US and elsewhere should remember is that Ukraine's fight and Eastern European security is also our fight and our security. And we've benefited enormously from having stable power structures in Europe. I don't think that we gain from, we certainly all lose if the rules-based international order, as it applies to Europe and as it applies to elsewhere, if that is allowed to falter.
So we'll move on to our next story in the latest news on Israel and Gaza. The Commissioner General for the main UN agency in Palestine has said that the scale of tragedy in Gaza is unprecedented. after visiting the besieged territory for the first time since the 7th of October. Felipe Lazzarini of the UNRWA described his visit to the Gaza Strip as one of the saddest days in my humanitarian work and urged a meaningful humanitarian response to prevent people in Gaza from dying. The Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt opened for the first time yesterday, and at least 335 dual nationals and 76 injured, seriously wounded, and sick people have crossed the border, with more expected to follow. Families of British citizens who are trapped in Gaza have said it is devastating that their loved ones have been turned away from the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. The Foreign Office has said that the first UK nationals have made it through, but it is understood that initially only 2 of the 500 people on a list of those eligible to leave were British nationals. An Australian minister confirmed that 20 Australian nationals had crossed the border at Rafah to exit Gaza yesterday. He went on to confirm that there are still 65 Australians stuck in Gaza that the government is supporting and are being provided consular assistance. Joe Biden has said that the US citizens were able to exit Gaza yesterday as a part of the first group of probably more than 1,000 people. The US president said the opening of the Rafah border crossing to wounded Palestinians and foreign nationals came after intense and urgent American diplomacy with our partners in the region. Some American citizens trapped in Gaza and their families in the US have launched legal action after weeks of desperate and futile attempts to exit the war zone. Israeli forces have continued to bomb the Palestinian territory from land, sea, and air as they press their offensive. Another blast shook the Jabalia, Gaza's largest refugee camp yesterday, a day after the Palestinian health officials said an Israeli airstrike killed about 50 people and wounded 150 more. Israel claims it killed a Hamas commander in the attack. 15 Israeli soldiers have been killed during combat in Gaza. The heaviest loss of life occurred when the Namir armored personnel carrier was hit at about noon on Tuesday by an anti-tank guided missile, killing 11 soldiers and wounding several more. The UN Human Rights Office said Israel's airstrike on Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp on Tuesday could amount to a war crime. The agency said it had serious concerns given the high number of civilian casualties and the scale of destruction after the strikes. The UN's humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths, said the airstrikes were just the latest atrocity to befall the people of Gaza, and said the world seems unable or unwilling to act. The only cancer treatment hospital in Gaza has gone out of service after it ran out of fuel, health officials reported yesterday. The director of the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital told a press conference, "We tell the world we don't leave cancer patients to a certain death due to the hospital being out of service." A senior Hamas official said that several hundred Israeli and other hostages are being held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip, who are subject to the same risk of death and destruction that Palestinians have faced. The warning was made after Hamas said that 7 hostages, including 3 foreign passport holders, were killed on Tuesday in the Israeli strikes on the Jabalia refugee camp. The health ministry in Gaza has said that 8,796 Palestinians, including 3,648 children, have been killed in Gaza since Israel began its campaigns of airstrikes and incursions. It's not possible for journalists to independently verify figures from either Israeli or Palestinian authorities. The UN's humanitarian office has reported that at least 123 Palestinians, including 34 children, have been killed in the Israeli-occupied West Bank since the 7th of October. The UN Child's Rights Committee has warned that grave human rights violations against children are mounting by the minute in Gaza and called for an immediate ceasefire. There are no winners in a war where thousands of children are killed, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child said in a statement yesterday. Pope Francis said yesterday that a 2-state solution was needed for Israel and Palestine. The head of the Catholic Church noted that Jerusalem should be given a special status. A senior UN official who sent a letter denouncing the organization's failure to protect civilians in Gaza had been subject to a review into allegedly biased social media posts after a pro-Israel lobby group complained. Craig Mokiba, director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, had been subject of complaint over his social media output, and his broadcast interviews had been under review since March. Jordan has told its ambassador to come back from Israel over the war in Gaza, the foreign ministry has said. The ambassador would only return to Tel Aviv if Israel halted its war in Gaza and ended the humanitarian crisis it had caused, the ministry has added. The BBC has announced it is launching an emergency radio service for Gaza in response to the conflict in the region. So, Richard, some really horrific scenes in Gaza at the moment. With regards to the Rafah crossing, how important is it that this crossing is properly, like the opening of it is properly controlled, and the people who need to get out, and aid is able to get in? Do you think that there's a danger that chaos could ensue at the crossing?
I think there is. So the importance of the Rafah crossing, at least as I understand it, is it's really the only way in and the only way out potentially in Gaza. And given that the IDF's military operations are primarily in the north of Gaza, it's the only safe way, or the safest way. I won't say it's a safe way, but it's the safest way in and out. And it's important that it's monitored appropriately because of that. I mean, the number of aid trucks getting in is nowhere near what it needs to be. The number of people getting out of Gaza is nowhere near what that needs to be for those who wish to get out. But, I don't think we should get away from the fact that what the Israeli government is doing is carrying out an act of collective punishment here in terms of the way it is harming the innocent people of Gaza in its pursuit of Hamas. Now, I hold absolutely no candle for Hamas or anything that they have ever done, and least of all the massacre that they perpetrated against innocent Israeli citizens. But quite frankly, the Israeli government has gone well beyond anything that is justifiable in international law. They need to be not operating and being guided by international law. They need to be upholding it because they are a state on the global stage. They need to be better than those they are fighting. And, right now, what they are doing is not in compliance with international law, and it is simply an act of collective punishment. And I think people are rightly recoiling with horror at the scenes that they continue to see. And the only way to take the smallest step forward on this is to have a ceasefire and to allow the aid to get in that needs to get in, not a humanitarian pause, but a ceasefire, because ultimately the solution to this is not military, it is political, and it involves two states and the establishment of a viable Palestinian state, which is able to be responsible for its own security and which is able to allow the people of Palestine and the Gaza Strip and West Bank to live beside their neighbours in peace and prosperity and dignity, but above all, peace. And I think that was recognised quite well in a statement that was issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Norway earlier today about the necessity of keeping the two-state solution possibility alive, and of the need to find a political solution to this. But in terms of first things first and small steps first, it's important that the Rafah crossing operates as it needs to, because right now it's the only way that people can escape, and it's the only way that the aid that is so desperately needed can get through.
And with regards to the UN, what can the UN actually do in response to war crimes, to prevent war crimes, and to try to ameliorate the conflict? Pragmatically, what can the UN actually do?
It depends on the international will that is there. I mean, I think the UN is a rather enfeebled organisation, but it's the only organisation we have, and it's the only hope that we have. And I would dearly love to see, be able to address human rights abuses at the time that they are addressed, rather than, years down the line in tribunals where it's possible to do so. It requires to stop this conflict. It requires either the self-restraint of the Israeli government to call off its defence forces and the attacks that they're perpetrating in Gaza and the harm they're doing to innocent people in Gaza, the disproportionate reaction that they've been involved in, or it requires a certain degree of unanimity around the table of the permanent members of the Security Council. And I think, sadly, whatever might be said behind the scenes, I think we're unlikely to see the kind of action that might actually help to draw this conflict to a swift conclusion.
So we are moving back to the UK for our next story. The UK government COVID inquiry continues today. Following revelations yesterday from former Deputy Cabinet Secretary Helen McNamara regarding a bullish confidence towards COVID in Number 10, as well as a disregard for COVID regulations and opposition from Boris Johnson towards Joint Ministerial Committee to the JMC meetings with other UK leaders. Today, former NHS England Chief Executive Simon Stevens gave evidence to the inquiry, questioned by Andrew O'Connor, KC, the counsel for the inquiry. Following him was Chris Wormald, the Permanent Secretary at the Department of Health, questioned by Hugo Kith, KC. Stevens stated in his own witness statement that Matt Hancock took the position that if decisions had to be made about who lived or died, then he, Hancock, should ultimately decide who lived and who should die. Stevens also agreed with Helen McNamara's witness statement where she had said that no one in Number 10 had a detailed understanding of the NHS and said Boris Johnson was wrong to blame the NHS not addressing bed blocking for necessitating lockdown. Stevens also stated that Hancock decided on the 11th of March that people discharged from hospitals into care homes would not be a priority for testing. Both Stevens and Wormald stated that they do not believe Matt Hancock lied during COVID, but Wormald did state that Hancock was over-optimistic and over-promised quite a lot, adding that Hancock deliberately set challenging targets. Wormald also rejected claims that the Department of Health and Social Care was chaotic or overwhelmed during COVID, though he did state that the relationship difficulties between Number 10 and the Cabinet Office occasionally affected the efficiency of the government machine. So, Richard, obviously you're in Westminster, you're a Westminster MP. Has there been any visible effects of this inquiry in the kind of morale or the general air in Westminster?
Well, it's hard to say because MPs at Westminster have been off on the summer recess. We came back for a week and a half. We then had a 3-week conference recess. And now Parliament is effectively shut or prorogued, as the authorities prefer to call it, awaiting the King's speech next week. So it's really, really difficult to judge a mood when you're not there to take it. But my short answer would be if it hasn't changed the mood of MPs, then it damned well ought to, because what we're seeing is what many of us thought was actually happening, that you had a number of ministers who had, as it was said yesterday, almost nuclear levels of confidence in themselves, which was not matched up by the level of confidence that their abilities would have entitled them to have in themselves. We've heard about that hardly a single day went past in Downing Street where their own COVID regulations were not breached. And today, the staggering, blood-curdling revelations that Matt Hancock wanted the power to decide who should live and who should die, or what categories of people should live or patients should be able to live or die in the event that the NHS found itself having to ration its care even more than it already did. So, this is deeply, deeply worrying stuff. I think what it shows is a rather amateurish government that was ill-prepared, despite the very, very able people who are in the civil service. And just this sense of, not just entitlement, but this sense of what's the word I'm looking for? Exceptionalism. That's it. That the Tory government at Westminster seemed to have, that when they spoke about the United Kingdom or Britain being world beating, it would be world beating in the way it beat the virus and how it recovered from it. They seem to think this was some kind of inbuilt automatic attribute that each of them had, simply because it had the good fortune to be born British and be a Tory MP, rather than something that they would have to work blood and sweat, blood and bullets for in order to achieve. So I think people should be looking at this, and I think they'd be entitled to feel very, very badly let down by those who were in the position of being the custodians of the machine of government at that moment in time. I think Lee Kane, one of Boris Johnson's most senior advisors, said that this was not the crisis for Boris Johnson's skill set. I'm not sure there's any crisis would be the crisis for his skill set, and I think it has exposed him dreadfully, and exposed the people who enabled him, who put him there, who lied for him, who covered up for him, who propelled him to a level in government well beyond that which his talents and abilities and attributes could tolerably ever have sustained by themselves. I think it should cause them to reflect on their behaviours and the way that they've treated politics almost as a game rather than as a serious vocation in terms of how scarce resources are allocated and how decisions are taken that take us all forward, because there is absolutely nothing that is good that I've heard that has come out of this, apart from the dignity and the self-sacrifice of the public servants, the unelected public servants. I'm talking about those in the NHS and the care sector, across the emergency services, and of course the sacrifices that people made themselves. But no, when I get back, there ought to be a mood of contrition amongst MPs that were responsible for overseeing or scrutinising the response in England. But I have to say, based on my experience of Westminster to date, I very, very much doubt that many, if any, will get themselves into that state of mind.
So we're staying with the UK now for our next story. Housing children in hotels violates their human rights and is dangerous, exacerbates trauma and can damage health, says the Children's Commissioner. A new report from the Children's Commissioner has stated that children in Scotland who are homeless or seeking asylum must not be housed in unsuitable accommodation such as hotels, hostels, B&Bs, cruise ships or barges because their human rights may be violated. The UK government policies mean that children seeking asylum in Scotland have often been placed in hotels. More children experiencing homelessness are also being housed in temporary hotel-type accommodation by local authorities due to a lack of suitable housing. The UK government has recently announced that some of the hotels will be closed. This is due to many refugees and asylum seekers being required to share rooms or being moved into other similar forms of accommodation such as barges or camps. The Office of the Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland's new report titled "Sometimes I Feel Like I Am in a Prison, Placing Children in Hotel-Type Accommodation," makes a range of recommendations to support local authorities, asylum accommodation providers, and frontline workers to minimise and mitigate the harm caused to children by these environments. Nicola Killian, Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland, said that our starting point is always that no child should have to live in a hotel or hotel-type accommodation. They are totally unsuitable and violate a wide range of children's rights. Adding that hotels are not a luxury option. They can be dangerous, exacerbate trauma, and cause long-term harm to health and development. Our report recommendations are for public authorities and accommodation providers to follow to ensure that they comply with their human rights duties to children. The recommendations can support frontline workers to advocate for children. Yvonne Blake, co-founder of Migrant Organising for Rights and Empowerment, MORE is the acronym, commented on the issue, saying that the welfare and rights of children is not political ping pong. Scotland should work to eradicate child poverty by providing an environment for all children and young people to have healthy childhoods and maximise potential. The report recommends that children should not be placed in a hotel type accommodation, where absolutely unavoidable, the hotel type accommodation for children must only be used as a last resort for the shortest time possible and in line with international and domestic law obligations. Public authorities and accommodation providers must do risk assessments and children's rights impact assessments. These should include whether or not rooms are child-proofed, the availability of age-appropriate sleeping spaces away from hazards, accessibility, and safety. It should also include risks presented by adults and the level of supervision and support provided by professionals. As well, the accommodation must meet the necessary standards to provide a child with an adequate standard of living, taking into account their rights to education, play, health, privacy, family life, safety, and development. So, Richard, how important do you think that empathy and understanding is when it comes to dealing with asylum seekers and when it comes to homeless children?
Oh, enormously important. I mean, I think you have to put yourself in the shoes of anyone of any age who is seeking asylum and is fleeing from the circumstances that would allow them to claim asylum. You know, the terror that you must be going through before you put yourself in a small boat, let alone your family, for example, or the civil strife that you're leaving behind, or the threats to your safety or your family's safety. Now, that's for adults who are notionally at least capable of, or who you would expect to have a greater capacity to understand and process these kind of feelings. When children are ripped from familiar surroundings and whatever comforting lies they're perhaps told about the journeys they're on, it's incredibly unsettling and disorienting. And to find themselves in a new place where they're unfamiliar with it, where they're unfamiliar with the language, where they're only familiar with their immediate family that's been able to accompany them. Uh, what can you do except offer empathy and sympathy and the chance to make the best of the situation that they're in. So that's for asylum seekers, but also for closer to home, children suffering from homelessness. Again, they can find themselves moved from familiar environments, and they can sense the unhappiness in the adults that are caring for them, and they know that they're different. They oughtn't to be, but they can tell that their situation is not like that of most of their peers at school or at nursery. So really all you can do is try and give them the best possible start in life from the position that circumstances have placed them in. And yes, there's a bit about meeting material needs, and sometimes that's hard enough to do with the systems that we have to work in. But I think what we have to recognise as well is the emotional needs and the trauma that's caused, and the way that the experiences that young children have in their earliest of years can go on to impact them, not just through childhood, not just through adolescence, but also right through adulthood. And then the impact that those behaviours and experiences can have on their own behaviours, and then the experiences that they wittingly or otherwise pass on to others, including perhaps their own children. So yes, we have a responsibility to provide people with safety, with comfort, with shelter. We can meet their material needs as best we can, and I dare say we could, in a rich society, we could do a better job of doing that. But I think it's hard sometimes for the state to meet emotional needs, but we need to be cognizant of people's emotional needs, particularly younger people, and make sure that we're meeting them as best we can as we help those children and the adults who look after them to forge the best future that they can out of whatever adverse circumstances they find themselves in.
Mm-hmm. So our next story of the night, the Bank of England has suggested that interest rates will remain high for an extended period of time in order to tackle stubborn inflationary pressures, and warns that the economy will be likely on the brink of recession in the possible coming election year. Rates have remained unchanged at 5.25%. for a second consecutive time, making this the highest level of interest rates since the 2008 financial crash. The bank stated that the risks from war in the Middle East and domestic inflationary pressures mean borrowing costs have to remain high despite the worsening outlook for growth. They anticipate that the flatlining growth throughout 2024, forecasting 4 consecutive quarters of zero growth in GDP if interest rates follow the expected path, and gave a 50-50 likelihood of a recession by mid-next year. The Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee voted by a majority of 6-3 to keep rates on hold, with a minority pushing for a quarter-point raise in interest rates. Inflation in the UK remained at 6.7% in September, due in part to a sharp rise in fuel costs that was offset by weaker growth in grocery costs. Britain currently has the highest inflation among any of the G7 group of so-called advanced economies. Commenting on the decision, SNP economy spokesperson Drew Hendry MP stated that this latest blow underlines how destructive Westminster's economic mismanagement has been on households across Scotland, adding that small independent countries similar to Scotland are wealthier and fairer than the UK. While the bank has forecast a drop in the inflation rate back to 2% target set out by the UK government by the end of 2025, it warned that interest rates would probably need to be kept restrictive for an extended period of time, and there was a danger that a further rate increases could be needed if inflationary pressures proved stronger than anticipated. So, Richard, this is obviously for the everyday viewer who maybe isn't particularly well versed in economic management or economic policy. What impact will keeping the interest rates the same have on the everyday person?
Well, what it does is it's going to keep the cost of borrowing higher than it was, and certainly higher than it was before Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng tried to blow up the economy with their unfunded tax cuts. Look, for anyone that's coming to the end of a mortgage deal, disclaimer, that includes myself actually, within the next few weeks, you're going to find that you're going to be paying quite a bit more every month than you were, simply because interest rates are higher. Just as an illustration, interest rates are now 5.25%. There or thereabouts, depending on what the banks are offering. I took out my last mortgage and it was about 2.5%. So, straight away I'm going to be paying double the amount of interest that I was before I start repaying any capital. That'll impact the rental market as well, because anyone that's got a buy-to-let mortgage will be paying a bit of a premium on that, and they will not want to see the amount of money that they're taking going down any more than they think it has to. So that's going to press through to make the cost of housing higher. Now, in Scotland, we're relatively fortunate that one of the reasons we've got lower levels of poverty than the rest of the UK isn't just because of measures like the Scottish Child Payment, important though that is. It's also because our housing costs are generally lower than a lot of other parts of the UK. So housing costs, it's going to mean that you're spending more on paying for the four walls around you, and that means that you've got less when it comes to being able to pay to heat your house, or to put food on the table. So that's really, in a nutshell, what the impact of this has had. I mean, I suppose we could take a certain amount of comfort from the fact that things aren't going to get any worse in that regard. But finally, let me say that the whole point of these interest rate rises is supposedly to control inflation. Now, the Bank of England is in charge of controlling inflation, and it's got one big lever in front of it to do that, which is the rate it sets for bank interest rates and mortgage rates. Now, I don't know anyone that was causing inflation because they had far too much money in their pockets and they were spending it too often because they'd found it too cheap to borrow. Basically, inflation was being fueled by the war in Ukraine, the spike in energy prices that we're still working through, and also because of Brexit, the elephant in the room. The UK Tory government is keen to point out that inflation is high all around the Western world. And so, well, that's true, but there's one country where it tends to be higher, and that's because of the self-inflicted wound that we've had in Brexit, because we've made it harder to import goods from overseas, and we've made our market collectively less attractive because of that and these frictions. So the fact is, everything's costing more. This is the one tool that they have in their box. They're not tackling the cause of inflation. Basically, the only way they can stop inflation by using interest rates is by pushing us closer and closer to a recession where there's fewer economic opportunities. And of course, people end up with even less money because pay settlements go down and people are out of work. So it's a particularly stupid way of trying to control inflation. What they should be doing is trying to lock in lower fuel prices by, excuse me, capitalising on our renewables and removing the trade frictions that have been put in place unnecessarily by Brexit, getting back into the single market. Those are the two single things that would have the greatest effect in bringing inflation down for the long term. But I suppose the one good thing we can say about today is that at least things haven't got any worse than they were yesterday.
That's at least one thing. So our next story, the oil and gas company Shell will give its shareholders $3.5 billion in share buybacks at the end of the fourth quarter, despite profits for the last quarter falling in line with lower oil and gas market prices. The company said its adjusted profits for the quarter fell to $6.2 billion this year, as opposed to the previous year's $9.5 billion. And this was broadly in line with the expectations of industry analysts. Apologies. Despite these lower earnings, Shell continued to offer its shareholders multi-billion-dollar windfalls each quarter. The $3.5 billion worth of shares follows buybacks over the last quarter. Shell's chief executive, Wael Sawan, said the company would hand shareholders $6.5 billion in share buybacks. Apologies, I'm just having some issues with the auto cue. In share buybacks in the second half of the year. He said in total, the company's shareholder payouts for 2023 stand at $23 billion. Shell reported an record annual profit of $40 billion last year, more than double that of 2021, with the TUC described as obscene and prompted calls for tougher windfall taxes, and has reported quarterly profits of $6.2 billion for July to September of 2023. Shell's share price has now hit a record high in recent weeks as concerns over the conflict in Gaza have pushed oil prices up once again, though concerns over the global economic outlook in recent days has led to prices easing again. Scottish Greens environment spokesperson Mark Ruskell responded to the latest update, stating that oil and company profits are fueling the destruction of the planet. Russell said that while things have rarely been better for oil and gas company bosses, but our environment cannot cope with their drive for endless oil and gas extraction. It is doing terrible damage here around the world, and it will have a devastating impact for generations to come, adding, there is no time to waste. We know the problem and we know the solutions. So, would you say, Richard, that you agree with the statement put out by the Green Party that these oil and gas companies are just completely ignoring the climate crisis just to pursue profits? We appear to have lost your sound.
Sorry, I have a mute button on my microphone, which I appear to be using far more enthusiastically than I should be. Apologies for that. Right, where I was I'm not going to use the words of the Green Party. I will use my own words, because there's plenty of people who would like to pin the words of the Green Party on me. Look, we need hydrocarbons, we need fossil fuels. We're in an energy transition. They're going to be around for a long time to come, and we're going to need companies to be extracting them to provide a lot of employment. And most of our energy needs still come from hydrocarbons, even though there's much that we can and should be doing to progress with the electrification of things like domestic heat and industry and the greater use of hydrogen in transport and industrial processes. So I'm very, very clear it's a transition. The Scottish Government, SNP Scottish Government, gets that too, with the £500 million that it's put on the table for energy transition in the northeast of Scotland, which is about £500 million more than the UK Government is putting into the creating the ecosystem that needs to go in round about that. But I think there's a couple of things that are wrong with this picture from the perspective looking at it from the UK government. First of all, there are still these massive profits despite the windfall tax that oil and gas companies are complaining about so vociferously. But also, and here's two figures, Shell today, despite its still pretty astronomical profits, albeit they're not as high as they were when it got the corporate windfall that came when Russia invaded Ukraine and supplies were interrupted. Shell today, despite being signed up to that transition, has apparently announced plans to lay off 15% of its low carbon solutions division workforce. And also, in a recent round of the UK government for floating offshore wind, they didn't get a single bidder interested in the auction at the price that the UK government was offering. So we've got a UK government that signed up to the idea of an energy transition, and yet all it's doing is offering as many oil and gas drilling licenses as it can offer, most of which will never ever be taken up, let alone come to fruition. And at the same time, they're failing miserably on the most scalable form of renewable energy that we have at present, which is floating offshore wind, to get that underway and to market in the latest round. So in policy terms, there's a few things that the UK government are clearly failing at and failing miserably at. But the one thing I would say is that there's a bit of an inconsistency, excuse me, in companies complaining about windfall taxes and then offering to carry out massive share buybacks from shareholders. That suggests that there's far too much money within the companies, despite what they say. And I would far rather that money was being invested in things like floating offshore wind, and that the government was providing the appropriate incentives so that we can bring about that transition at the pace and the scale that we need. As it is, we have to hope that the tax system will catch some of those share buybacks on the way past. I have to say, though, I hate my doots. But, maybe that's something a chancellor should be looking at, because if the companies have money to effectively give away in terms of buying up their own share capital like that, that's money that one way or another I would like to see being invested in the renewables transition at the scale and the pace that we need. And if the companies themselves aren't going to do that, then the Chancellor should be stepping in to intercept that money and put it to the use that the companies are obviously disinclined to do. So it remains to be seen whether other oil and gas companies follow Shell's lead in terms of share buybacks. But I think if the fact that they're in a position to do that at all tells me very strongly that there's something not quite right with the way the energy transition is going, and that government should be looking closely at that to see how it can step in.
Mm-hmm. So our next story, we are moving internationally. China and the United States look set to discuss nuclear arms control next week, in the first nuclear arms control talks between the two countries since the Obama administration. The talks will likely be held on Monday, and Mallory Stewart, a senior State Department official at Sunjiao, the head of the arms control department at China's foreign ministry, according to the Wall Street Journal. On Monday, China's foreign ministry stated that the two countries would hold consultations on arms control and non-proliferation in the days to come, as well as carrying out separate talks on maritime affairs and other issues. This follows the Chinese Foreign Policy Minister Wang Yi's visit to Washington. The Pentagon reported in October that China had over 500 operational nuclear warheads in its arsenal and will probably have more than 1,000 by 2030. However, the US itself has an estimated stockpile of more than 3,700 nuclear warheads. The arms talk will possibly occur before a potential meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the US President Joe Biden in San Francisco this month. Although a senior Biden administration official reportedly said that that the details were yet to be determined. So, Richard, would you say that this is a positive step in relations between Russia and China? And do you think that there will be any tangible outcomes from these talks?
I honestly don't know. I mean, relations between Russia and China are complex. There's many moving parts there. Chinese economic growth has stuttered quite a bit over the last few years. The West has not been quite such a willing market. There's been a growth of a middle class Chinese market, which has also found its ability to sustain China's seemingly ever growing productive capacity sated. So not even the Chinese market's able to drive Chinese growth now, and also there's huge environmental challenges. But anything which increases security in that part of the world, I think, is a good thing. I think it's important that China should be engaged. As I say, I think that China, its main interest in Russia is it doesn't want the Russians to be doing anything, or the Russian government to be doing anything that destabilises Chinese interests in the world. I think it's quite a transactional relationship above all else. We should see it for what it is in that sense. But I think, the Chinese objectives where Russia is concerned is to give China a bit more strategic freedom to operate within, and Beijing probably judges it can do that, given where Russia is in terms of its relationships with much of the rest of the world at the moment. But Russia, for all its domestic economic difficulties, and for all that it's bogged itself down in a war that's unwinnable from a Russian perspective in the Ukraine, Russia is still a giant in terms of its landmass and natural resources, and certainly I think the Chinese are still looking longingly at the oil and gas that Russia can supply their economy with. And none of course, that's just a reaction to recent events. What we maybe forget is that Beijing and Moscow, share a very, very long land border and have been dealing with each other's aspirations and ambitions there for quite a long time. So, I'm not really sure I've got a great deal more to it than that, other than that whatever headlines come out of this, ultimately this is a transactional relationship, and we should not be blind to that or naive about it.
Perfect. And our final story of the night comes back to Scotland, following the First Minister's letter to the UK political leaders urging for a ceasefire in Gaza last week. First Minister Hamza Yousaf has pledged £250,000 to support displaced people in Gaza in accessing food, water, shelter and medical supplies. The additional money takes the total given to assist relief efforts in Gaza to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency Flash Appeal, the UNRWA, to £750,000. The UNRWA Flash Appeal is intended specifically for Gaza to help tackle the unfolding humanitarian disaster, with an estimated 1.4 million people displaced by conflict and military evacuation orders. More than 670,000 people are currently seeking shelter in UNRWA shelters in Gaza. On the issue, First Minister Hamza Yousaf said, "I have been repeatedly calling for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, but while we press this vital issue, it's important that we support the Palestinian people as much as we can." He later added, "My thoughts remain with all those caught in the middle of the escalating conflict in Israel and Gaza. The killing of innocent civilians can never be justified wherever it occurs." Marta Lorenzo, the director of the UNRWA Representative Office Europe, said that Scotland has proven that they stand hand in hand with Palestinian refugees and those suffering in Gaza, adding that with this vital funding, the agency will be able to continue providing essential and life-saving aid. With the ongoing crisis deepening further each day, it is vital for more donors to step forward and support millions of people in the Gaza Strip. So, Richard, obviously this is a big step for Hamza Yousaf when it comes to international aid and everything like that. Would you like to see more humanitarian efforts made by governments? And do you think that Hamza Yusuf is trying to lead the way in terms of that? I think you're muted again.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes, and yes would be my answer to that. There are some people who question why the Scottish government would give aid, as if, and sometimes the answer comes back, we would question why you give aid because it's not directly within the purview of the Scottish government's devolved powers as they would see it. And, the way that some people make that argument, you would think that if only we didn't do this, then just about every other problem elsewhere in Scottish society would magically find itself solved. I have to say I don't agree with that. I think we, with our experience of history, our experience of interacting with the world, we bring a pretty unique perspective of mass immigration in Scotland, mass emigration, and of the economic and military forces that can buffet nations over time. So I think we've got a pretty, not a special view, but we've got a view that's certainly unique to us, and it's a view that's worth being heard and that isn't always reflected in the stance of UK government. So I think that it's right that we try where we see problems in the world that we can make a contribution to lessen, that we do so, that we provide the political leadership on that where we can, and that we provide the humanitarian leadership also in that where we can. It will be a vanishingly small impact in the overall scheme of things, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing, because it will have an enormous impact on those whom it reaches and can help. And if it helps to encourage others, whether that's nation states or subnational governments elsewhere, to step up and do the same, then that's a very good thing. Because I think sometimes, and we've been speaking about some fairly significant forces in the world over the course of the last 55 minutes or so, it's not always the biggest countries that have the biggest, most positive impacts. There's a phrase I'm very fond of, that it's not the examples of your power as a country that matters, it's the power of your example. And certainly I think that the Scottish government, on behalf of the people of Scotland, is certainly setting a very powerful example in terms of the humane way that it is approached, not just the problem in Gaza, is not just the situation in Gaza, not just from the First Minister's very, very deep and sincere personal stake in the outcome there, but also in terms of the way that we've responded to humanitarian crises elsewhere in the world over the last few years, whether that's in Syria or the Ukraine or many other places. So I think it's important that we recognise that we are a global nation, that and that the sites of our politicians aren't just focused on the day-to-day, important as that is, that there is a world out there and we're very much a part of it, and that we have a distinct voice and a distinct experience to bring to bear, and we also have a responsibility to recognise that and bring it to bear in the best way that we possibly can.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Richard, for joining us. That's the end of the programme tonight. I hope you've enjoyed your time on Broadcasting Scotland.
Very much.
So before I go, I just wanted to remind you that, of course, here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who's donated and to everyone who already makes regular monthly payments, thank you so much. Our programmes will, of course, always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still really pressing. Thank you to the generosity of those who have helped us raise £20,200. So we have £9,800 left to raise, and that need is really urgent. So please share our channel, subscribe if you can, and good night, and thank you for watching.